Hinges in all forms and styles are not only a useful project, but they can be a lot of fun in the blacksmith shop, and in most cases, they don't take a big expense in tools and materials. Today, I thought I would share with you a demonstration that I did for the May Smiths virtual Zoom demo, and it was all about hinges with a particular focus on different ways of forming the eye for the hinge, because that is the critical part. If you can get a good eye, the rest of the hinge is mostly aesthetic at that point. I'd like to welcome you to the May 2021 Rocky Mountain Smiths virtual demo here on Zoom. And for this demonstration, I'm going to talk about hinges, strap hinge and pintle, and maybe a butterfly hinge, and we'll do these start to finish as much as time allows. But mostly I want to look at some different ways of forming hinge eyes. I want to look at rolling an eye like this hinge has at the anvil. This butterfly hinge is rolled up under the fly press using a special jig. And then I want to look at a forge welded eye. In fact, I think we're going to start with the forge welded eye and a forge welded pintle, the more traditional stuff, and we'll finish that hinge completely. Then we'll go on to the other stuff. Since I don't actually have a need for any specific hinges or anything ordered, I'm just going to use some random material out of the scrap pile. This is a piece of 1/4 by 1 1/4. It's about 13 inches long. So that's about 6 mil by 30 mil by about 330 mil. I think I'll just make a pretty typical spade hinge out of this. And to start that, I'm just going to go ahead and cut an angle on this, which is easier than trying to forge the point. And I center that point up. Then I'm going to put a shoulder in this to isolate the finial from the main body of the hinge. And I'll just use butcher's and a guillotine tool to set that. Then I'll spread that finial with the cross peen and some half-face blows on the edge of the anvil. Then I just want to put a bevel on the front of this because I think the bevel looks nice. If you flip this over and tip it up on edge a little bit so that the bevel is flat against the anvil, it leaves a much smoother bevel, and the hammer marks are all on the back that way. The eye is probably the most critical part of the hinge. If you get the eye right, you have a working hinge. The rest of it is kind of aesthetic. For this hinge, I want to do forge welded eye. In theory, that is stronger, although I think in modern mild steel, it's probably negligible. In wrought iron, I think that was probably pretty important to keep that from bending right at the hinge eye. This will start with a simple scarf, and the forge weld will happen on the back of the hinge, so no scarf line shows on the front. So if that scarf line shows on the back, it's not really a big deal. Then we'll bend the eye, drift it roughly to size. I'm going to use a 3/8 drift pin, and then we'll forge weld it. Sorry about that. I think I had the camera off when I did the scarf. It's just a real simple taper, nothing fancy for a hinge. I want to start forming the eye by putting a 90-degree bend in this, and I want to do that to the side of the hinge that I want the eye on in the final hinge. Typically that's to the front, but not always. Then with a pair of tongs I can start bending this back upwards. I'm going to try to get this eye as close to the final size as possible before I do the weld, so that all I have to do is run the drift through one last time after it's welded. As this comes up to heat, I'm going to open it up just a little bit and put some flux in there. Lately I've been using the flux from Iron Mountain and it seems to work pretty well. I also switched to a lighter hammer at this point so I can use light rapid blows to set the weld. Go ahead and try and blend the taper from the eye forward to where we stopped tapering it before. And then this is an excellent opportunity to go ahead and punch a hole. This first hole I make sure goes through both sides of the weld so that the weld is also being supported by whatever holds this to the door. That hole's probably a little bit big, but for hinge this size, I'd probably still put another hole in here and one out at the finial. This one might be a much smaller hole. And one last drifting of the eye at this stage. Gotta make sure it's square this way. If not, figure out what you got to do to fix it. Try not to work little flat spots and kinks into it by working in the same place over and over again. Now about these drift pins for doing hinges. I like to make these out of S7 drill rod. It makes a really good long-lasting drift pin. As I recall, when I did these, I did harden them and temper them, but I've not done anything since, and sometimes they get glowing a little bit red, and occasionally you got to straighten them out some, but it does hold up better than anything else I've ever tried. One end has a long, narrow taper that will fit into an undersized eye so you can get the thing started and drive it up. There's a section in here that is full diameter, and that's what you're working around when you're working on the hinge. And then there's a shorter taper on the top side that is long enough that it will fall all the way free of the hinge. So if you're working 1.5 inch material, you need a little bit more than 1.5 inches in this upper taper. So naturally, if you're working in wider material, if you're doing 4-inch hinges, you're going to need a much longer drift pin. There's also some logic in buying drill rod that's one size smaller, so a 32nd or a 64th smaller than the eye, so that you can ream the eye out to perfect size, and then it's a much smoother running eye. I think most of mine are exact size. They usually shrink a little under anyways, and I still have to run a drill bit through them. But I'm not making real high-end hinges. Most of mine are kind of barn door hinges, shutter hinges, things like that. Well, what do you say we go ahead and make a pintle for that? I'll just make a simple drive pintle. It'll be forge welded with a piece of 1/2 inch square bar for the main body and a piece of 3/8 rod for the pin that the hinge sits on. I need to allow roughly 3 times the pin diameter for the eye and the pintle. So 3/8 pin, I need about 9/8. So that's about 1.1 inch material to wrap for the eye. The hardy hole on this anvil is 1.25 inches. So if I make this just a little shorter than that, it should be about right. And I'll insert the actual pin, close that up. I want to make sure the pin is securely welded in before I worry too much about drawing the spike out. But don't make it too small and don't mess up the pin. Put the pin down through a bolster plate so I can clean up the shoulder on the top of the pintle. Then I'll cut this off, turn it around, and finish drawing out the spike. To straighten that pin again. Let's use a monkey tool with a deep enough hole. That should make that nice and plumb. Okay, at the beginning of the demo I said that we're going to look mostly at making hinge eyes. So let's look at another eye that would work on essentially that same little strap hinge. Only this time it's going to be wrapped and not forge welded. To get a nice clean wrap on these so it tucks in neatly, it's ideal to have a bevel on the end of the bar. About 45 degrees seems to work pretty good. That's a little bit difficult to just forge in. You can do it. I frequently will just grind them or cut them in, or I have a tool that I can use under the treadle hammer or power hammer. This is a 90-degree cutoff tool, and it's got a stop on either side of it so I can use it on the dies here and not worry about cutting into my dies or destroying the tool. I think this is H13. In use, you just cut the end of the bar off and it leaves a nice 45-degree bevel. And then just like with the forge welded eye, I want to try and roll this up as close as possible to exact size before I worry about the drift. And I start with the cut bevel facing up. So if you want your eye on the front of the hinge, cut that bevel on the back side of the hinge so the long side is to the front, short side to the back. So you should be able to see how that tucks in nice and cleanly. I think this actually makes a much smoother running eye than the forge welded eye. And in mild steel, I think it's plenty strong. That eye really came out very nice, but sometimes when you're doing a production run, some of them want to argue with you and fight you, and you don't get things tucked in quite right. So I've got this little bottom tool that I made that's got a swedge on the top and a kind of a swedge with a real sharp edge over here that helps tuck that eye in. And I'll kind of show you how that works, even though that eye looks good already. This is made from 4140 and it is sized for 1/4 inch material with a 3/8 eye. I use it for other things as well, but that's what it fits the best. And I really should make another one for doing 1/8 inch material with a 1/4 inch eye, which is something I do a lot of. So if you're having trouble tucking that eye in, you can put that here and work there. And if it's not straight here, you can come up here, and that gives you enough room to work it up and down so you're not just flattening one spot of it. Do the same thing in here. And that can really help solve some problems, but it's better to get it right the first time. Now this butterfly hinge that I talked about making earlier in the video, I unfortunately don't have any more blanks for. These are some that I buy as a pre-cut blank from a laser cutter, and they're done in both halves of the hinge, so there's very little filing or fitting that needs to be done in most cases to make a working hinge out of these. These are kind of a production hinge. They don't have quite the character of most hand-forged hinges, but they are a pretty quick thing to do. I do have the blanks for these little tiny ones, so we'll take a look at that. And this takes an opposite approach of these other hinges. Instead of forging it around a pin, These are done inside of a die under the fly press, and they're just pushed down in this until it follows its way around the hole. And that's pretty much all that you need to do. Sometimes they get stuck, you usually need a pin punch to get them out, and it helps if you oil the die first. But this die does these bigger hinges. This die does the smaller size hinges. I think these are 16 gauge. And both of these, the dies, and for that matter, the hinge blanks, I get from, I think it's Stony Point Forge or Stony Creek Forge. I'll look it up and put it down here in the video so you can see it. And he sells some fly press tooling and a lot of laser cut stuff. And that's where I get this stuff from. I've tried making these myself, and they are never quite as precise as they need to be, and they have trouble following the curve because I don't get my slot quite right. I'm not a machinist, and I don't really have the tools to do this kind of stuff with the precision that it requires. Before we put that in the die, it helps to start this bend just a little bit, and this little thing came from the same place, is all it really needs to just start that. And it goes in the vise so you can get a good start on this. The top tool doesn't need to be anything special, it's just a flat pusher. Now these smaller hinges use an 1/8 inch pin, so I'm just using gas welding rod, and I grind a little bevel on the end of that, so hopefully it will find the hole as I drive it through there. Really easy to bend these little pins. It looks like it's going in. And that'll need to be trimmed off, and this can be peened, but I don't need to show that as part of this. And they'll need to be worked in. I usually heat these, and then I typically go ahead and scale them and put a little bevel around them, just so they aren't quite as sterile a little hinge. I've also had some of these H&L style hinges cut out somewhere at one point. These use the bigger jig, so I'll go ahead and roll one of these up. But I'm not going to worry about cutting all the knuckles and things like that right now. I have a similar jig that I've made for this size hinge. Again, a little bit of oil in the die. It's a little easier to get out if you bring it to the end there. And then one smooth, long push. See, that one I'm going to have to hammer some. Got my camera in the way. But it does work. And again, it probably needs to be driven out of there. It looks like I bottomed out my punch. Pull it out by hand, I guess. So that's just another way of doing a hinge eye. This is really quite efficient for production work. I can do dozens of these hinges in a morning or an afternoon session. These at the knuckles are not pre-cut on because I use them differently depending on what I'm working on. Definitely take longer to cut the knuckles than these that I buy with the knuckle pre-cut. If I ever do these again, I'll have them done with the knuckle pre-cut, and if I need different variations, I'll just pay extra to have those done. So that's just a look at some hinge ideas, specifically some different ways you can roll hinge eyes, lots of different options. Use whatever suits your skill level and the tools and the material that you have in your shop. I do hope you have time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, but stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next one.